Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. On this show, we will be exploring the issues faced by men and boys everywhere. Your host, Erin Pizzey, opened the first ever domestic violence refuge for battered women and children in Chiswick, England. What she found, however, was that many of the women coming into her shelter were as violent as the men they were fleeing. Over the years, she also tried to create resources and safe spaces for men as well as women, but frequently met with indifference and hostility to men's suffering.
For so many years, feminists have been able to demonize men under their artificial argument called patriarchy. Hi, I'm Erin Pizzey, and through working with battered women in my refuges, I saw for myself how family violence is passed on from one generation to the next. Quite simply, violent behavior is often carried forward into adult relationships. Family violence is not a gender issue, and never was. It's a generational issue. Feminists have had people believe that men are responsible for all the violence in our society. There is sufficient evidence that both men and women can be equally violent in their personal relationships.
The truth is that men and boys are not privileged in our society, but are often marginalised, disadvantaged and ignored. Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Saturday, April 12th, 2014 episode of Revelations with Erin Pizzey. I, as usual, am Erin's co-host, Dean Esme, also operations manager at A Voice for Men. How you doing this afternoon, Erin?
I'm very fine. I have a lovely afternoon cup of tea in front of me.
Oh, excellent. How's the weather in London this afternoon?
It's beautiful. The daffodils are almost over and the tulips are coming up. It's a lovely time to be in England.
Oh, excellent. The weather's just hitting spring here today, so it's all still kind of a little gray out here. I'm pleased to say that today our special guest is Professor Richard Felson. Professor Felson is Professor of Criminology and Sociology within the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Penn State University, which I would guess is in the state of Pennsylvania somewhere. Are you with us, Professor Felson?
Well, I am here, and it's good to be here. And yes, I am in Pennsylvania.
And can we call you Richard or Rich?
Please, Rich. Rich is good.
Rich works. Excellent. I see that you got your degree in sociology, your PhD in sociology, that is, in 1977 at Indiana University. Is that right?
That's right.
And
I've been around.
You have been around. You have been around. I understand that. Well, we're going to talk about a lot of things because your work is primarily centered, it looks like, to me, on violence, both sexual and non-sexual, but for the most part, your work, if I understand it correctly, is centered not so much on domestic violence, which is what we mostly concentrate here on in this show, but in violence in general, criminal violence in particular, what it looks like, where it comes from, etc. Would that be a fair summation of a 30-year career?
Absolutely, fair enough.
Cool. And I know you've gotten some kickback or pushback throughout your career because one of the things that you've mentioned about research to me is that you find that a lot of the research out there that's done on violence, people aren't very clear with their terminology, and I was curious what you meant about that.
Well, for science, it's very important to use accurate language. For activism, you might try to dramatize and exaggerate and make things seem worse so you can get people to pay attention to your social problem. So when we're talking about violence, sometimes the activists in the area of domestic violence will talk about wife beating or battered wives. Whereas if you're doing science, you want to only use the phrase the word beating if there is an actual beating, a repeated attack. Everybody knows what a beating really is. So if there's a push and a shove, don't call it a beating. But if you're an activist, you want to draw attention to your problem. So you count all the minor stuff, which most crime is minor, and you count it, and then you give this serious label, and you can mislead people. Well, maybe all for a good cause, but you've got to compete in the marketplace for attention to your social problem. And so in a lot of areas related to social problems, people use language that's inaccurate.
Well, as far as I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
As far as I'm concerned, Rich, I just think an awful lot of that kind of language is fraudulent, because nobody can pretend that pushing, shoving, even throwing something makes you a victim of domestic violence. It's inappropriate behavior, if you like. So I don't let anybody off by saying it's because they promote their cause. I just think they're fraudulently trying to raise money.
Well, it certainly is fraudulent. I agree.
Good.
I'm something of an activist myself, and while I don't shy away from occasionally inflammatory rhetoric, in my dealings, I believe that effective activism starts with the truth and with accuracy. Because if you're in the habit of lying and exaggerating, rhetoric is different, right? Making a rhetorical point with a little sharp tongue is one thing, but outright deceiving people, eventually deception catches up with you.
Well, I hope so.
And I'm
not sure. They've been very successful in getting attention.
50 years now.
Yeah.
Nearly, yeah.
But I'd like to believe that there's justice in the world and the truth will win out. But, it's been a long time, as Erin just said.
One of the papers that you've published that interested me and probably interests our audience a lot was entitled, "Is Violence Against Women About Women or About Violence?" And in there you explore a lot of things in that particular paper, but what was the gist of what you found there in that paper?
Well, that was a sort of a review of my work and others' work. The question is when men hit women, is it because they're sexist? And the fact that it is a woman leads them, they don't like women or something? Or is it violence is violence, and people engage in violence sometimes. Women are half the population. So, if men struck out randomly, they'd hit some women. And the question is not why do women get hit, but why they don't get hit nearly as often as men do. In other words, there's much more victimization of men than of women. It's mostly committed by men, but and I'm not talking about in the family now. I'm talking about generally.
Yes.
And so the men who do much of the most serious stuff are men who commit violent crimes and other crimes in other circumstances. So they tend to be offenders, criminals, more than they're sexists. And that's part of the argument I make. You have some bad people in the world, many of them men. It's not surprising that they would also hit their wives. So that's the point of viewing violence against women as violence. Now, there may be some differences between violence against women and violence against men, but the only way to find that out is to examine both and then compare. That's what science does. You compare. But the study of violence against women has been what I've called academic apartheid. They just study violence against women, typically, and don't make comparisons. And so you can make a lot of statements that are misleading if you have this tunnel vision and just focus on one type of violence. So I say compare, always compare.
But Rich, most of them aren't really educated enough to even get as far as comparing. If you look at an awful lot, the research that's been done on domestic violence by the domestic violence industry is infantile, and most of the reporting is actually unusable because, exactly as you said, it's never been properly done. In this whole history, which is nearly 50 years old now, there's been no research done on what has been happening in those refuges, what has happened to the women who come in, what's happened to the children. Dead silence, no accountability, just a string of false evidence.
Well, I have to, you're using strong language. I'm sitting here in a sociology department in the field of criminology and sociology, and so, I mean, everybody thinks I'm outspoken, but I mean, you're basically right, you know.
I think
now they are, no, but I'd say it a little differently.
Okay.
Some of these people are well trained, yet they don't use their training. And it's not that they don't know that. You're supposed to use accurate language, and you're supposed to make comparisons. They just, I guess they compartmentalize. I don't really understand what they're thinking. They're sort of beyond my comprehension.
Well, yes, because if your unshakable core belief is that all men are violent and all women are innocent victims of men's violence because men across the world have oppressed women, that's your core belief. Anything that challenges it is going to make you massively uncomfortable. That's why people have tried, and I have, with well-known feminists, and you find you can get absolutely nowhere.
Yes, I've had that experience.
Yeah, but have you ever thought, because I can talk to women who, on the whole, are highly intelligent, but you get to that one subject, and then suddenly all the shutters are down.
That's my experience. Here's something, I'm not sure this is true, but I think when you tell them something, they have no place to store it in their mind.
Well, no, because it's a core belief, Rich.
Yes, they'll forget it the next day.
Yeah.
And they just don't know how to assimilate it.
And it's interesting because most of those women, as feminists, and obviously some femme men, they tend to live in this incredibly incestuous group, and they only really communicate with each other because the rest of us are all seen as the unenlightened.
Yes, that's right. They're incestual, absolutely.
What you mean intellectually, of course.
Yeah.
In case anybody's confused, right? Intellectually.
Right, intellectually. Academic apartheid is related to that, yes.
Yeah. And this is presumably what's leading to the terrible situation across the campuses in America, and it's certainly beginning to bloom here. I think it's been in Australia for a very long time, and Canada is a desolate desert when it comes to domestic violence or violence of any understanding of violence. Can we go on to what you have understood in all your scientific work, where the roots of violence occur?
Well, I take a social psychological approach because I had psychology and sociology, and I had, in my career, I was studying non-controversial stuff, not till about 1990 when I started studying, just did a paper on rape, and I had an idea and I did it, but before that I was studying self-concept and some other stuff, and none of it controversial. But then I became controversial, and now I've forgotten your question. Could you repeat it?
I was just asking you about the roots of violence.
Oh, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. So I take a social psychological approach, and I view domestic violence, is related to conflicts in the family.
Yeah.
You live with somebody, you're going to have disagreements.
Yeah.
And some of those disagreements are going to get out of hand, particularly when somebody in that relationship is problematic, has a bad temper. And difficult people tend to marry difficult people. So
what scientifically makes them difficult?
Well, now I don't study individual differences myself, but there's probably a genetic aspect to it. It's low self-control. Testosterone is related. There are a variety of things that lack of empathy, etc. But nobody's really worked that out. But I'm saying that social life involves conflict between people.
Yeah.
You want to do one thing, and I want to do something else. Now, if we don't have dealings, we get along fine. But when we're working together on something, and I want this and you want that, then you get into arguments.
Well, but in these cases, we're not talking about arguments. We're talking about stubbing cigarettes on your wife because she doesn't agree with you, or she actually slashes your face with a broken glass.
Right. Some of these become very serious. There's an alcohol effect. Mm-hmm. There's some people, you get into an exchange of insults and violence, and then it escalates and somebody does something terrible, including murder.
But those are only in specific families. The general population of normal people, I mean, the worst that would probably happen is somebody shoves somebody or slams out of the room, but we're talking about this bottom end. It's interesting. What happened with your paper on rape? Because I think this is where you first became controversial, yes? Oh,
that was an early one, 1990, and that I had trouble publishing it on motives for rape. And but I published it finally got it into a journal. I've always been able to get them finally in somewhere.
Yeah.
But it's hard to do. My latest 3 papers. Well, I stopped doing it for 20 years. And then because it's such a people get out of that area.
Sorry, go ahead, Dean.
No. Would that be the paper, What Do Rapists Want? Or is that...
No, that's something very recent, based on my recent 3 papers on that topic. And that is, that's unpublished, what I sent you. I'm trying to get, that's for a popular audience. I'm trying to get some, and somebody's going to write it up, a professional writer said she wanted to write something up on it, so.
I see, but the gist of it is... so this is basically be a summation of your previous work for a popular audience. So I guess we'll look for What Do Rapists Want by Professor Felson at some point in the future. We'll alert people when it comes out. But you're I don't even know if the word, it will be controversial, but I don't think it should be. Because basically it appears to me that your answer is rape is not, as the feminist narrative would have it, about power ultimately. It's ultimately about sex. Is that a fair way of putting it?
That's a fair way. Should I go on, or you want to ask me something?
Go ahead, please do.
Go ahead, yeah.
What I say is something very different than most people say. I say sexual assault, rape, is as much a crime against young people as it is against women. A 15-year-old boy is at greater risk of being sexually assaulted than a 40-year-old woman. Mm. And what I think that has to do with is the young people are sexually attractive. There's also more opportunity because they go out more, and they're maybe vulnerable in certain ways. But even when you control that, you get a strong preference for people 15 to 29. And what's interesting about that also is when men assault men sexually, same age pattern. The murder age of the victim is 15 when men attack men or men attack women. And to my surprise, we also found that when women commit sexual assault, which they make up 3% of the cases, they targeted 15-year-olds most often. And that was whether they were attacking a female or a male. So they don't do it very often, but they have it looks like the same preference. So that's a very different way of looking at sexual assault. And I'm hoping that has an impact.
Just to clarify for our audience who may be a little less technical, you said they tend to be 15-year-olds. You're meaning an average or median age there.
Yeah, median meaning the most frequent age in which a person is sexually assaulted is 15, whether you're male or female. That's when you're most at risk. And then it declines. It declined much earlier than I thought. I thought they would be victimized, at 21. or something like that, right? Or college age, but 15 was more frequent.
Now, your 3% figure for female offenders, I'm not gonna debate you much on that because it's a little out of scope. But I would direct people to check out the interview Erin and I did with Philip Cook on when women sexually abuse men, because there's reason to believe that 3% figure is much too low. But that's not what we're here to talk about. I just thought I'd mention it for our listeners. The archive of that show and the discussion of that issue is on YouTube, same channel. In any case, so what you're essentially suggesting is let's say the feminist narrative that it's all about men's desire to dominate like patriarchs is scientifically questionable. Would that be about right?
Yes.
What about the fact that the majority of serial killers have had incestuous relationships with their mothers, and they look for women to murder, largely prostitutes, who resemble their mothers?
Well,
how does that fit in?
I'm not sure if that's true. I mean, I don't. When I've looked at that literature, first of all, it's hard to study that because you don't have many serial killers, enough of a sample, but. Okay. And I don't really have an explanation. First of all, they're very rare serial killers. Most people, aren't serial killers. They get involved in arguments or they commit felony murders or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. And the other question I was going to ask you is, in the very beginning, when all this started about domestic violence, I used to point out that if it was all men who hit women, then why were the figures so high for lesbian relationships? And
right.
And then I was looking at the amount of rape that goes on between lesbian couples. And I don't think that's something anybody's ever looked at.
Well, I could say something about that from my work.
Could you?
Yes.
Please.
The rate, now, I should say my data is based on reported instances, and we had like hundreds of thousands. So a big sample, but it's only reported, and we tried to do a correction for reporting using some other figures, and so we tried as best we can to address that. But women, first of all, when women commit the sexual assaults, it's split who they target, women or men. It's not much difference. Mm-hmm. But the rate of female on female is much less than the rate of male on male. It's like a male on male is like 11.5% of the time when men commit a rape or sexual assault, they target a man. Mm-hmm. And women, it's like 1 or 2% when women will attack a woman. Mm-hmm. So it's much more likely male on male.
Could that
now? But one thing is, I think you're paying a lot of attention to lesbian and gay, and I think that's critical to do that. I try to do that in my own work if you can get enough gay couples.
Yeah.
Because it says something about the role of gender.
Yes.
If gay couples fight as much as or have as much violence as straight couples, it suggests what's going on is living together and the conflicts that produces, as opposed to gender and hating women. So it's a very important comparison.
Well, I think one of the things we should look at is where people are diagnosed with disorders, whether it's narcissism or bipolars or whatever the disorders are, particularly narcissism. It makes it very hard for them to have relationships, extremely hard. Mm-hmm. And that's often where you'll find the violence. Because certainly in terms of narcissistic exhibitionists, which I work with a lot, and I tend to work with women, occasionally I work with men, I find that particular condition, you have to be very careful of people who get into relationships with those women, because not only are they terrible relationships, but the relationships to the children are also very damaging.
The people who have problems, various difficulties, mental problems, they tend to get victimized more. And not just by their spouses, but in general, they get victimized more. And it's clear that the people can engage in provocative behaviors, or maybe they just screw up in their, that can provoke people if they perform poorly and they've got drug problems. People get angry at them, and they get into conflicts, and then you get some violence sometimes against them. They are victimized. So it's not just affecting alcohol and drugs doesn't just affect offending, it affects victimization as well.
There was a fascinating study that I saw, and I'm sorry to say I do not have the reference handy, but if anybody pushes me, I will go and look for it. This was specifically a study on sociopaths, psychopaths, and I mean clinically diagnosed sociopaths, not just a generic term, with a history of violence. And one of the interesting things that they found was that these sociopaths, and I don't remember how big their sample size, but it was more than 10. It was reasonable. And all they did was show pictures on video camera of somebody walking down a hall, and they'd controlled the group, and they had about 10 go by, and they had two, I believe it was two in the group, just walk down the hall, and ask the sociopath which of these is your most likely victim, and with about 90% accuracy, they all picked the same two people, and those were two people who'd already been severely assaulted and beaten. Mm-hmm. And with uncanny accuracy, they were able to find them and just spot them by the way they walked, which is interesting information. I mean, those who've been abused tend to be targets of abuse, and it would tend to, I don't know, just corroborate your point at least a little bit.
How about normal people who had, do they also?
Well, I mean, the point was the sociopaths, the criminally violent sociopaths, were able to say, yes, that's somebody I would go for, and almost every time, it picked a person that they had no way of knowing had a history of violence in their background. Right.
Well, you know, one of the things... I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Well, my point is that people who have suffered abuse unconsciously appear to have body postures and ways of walking alone that makes them look like they're vulnerable.
Right, right.
Dean, when you talk to pedophiles, and both men and women, which I've done for many, many years, what they'll tell you is the child they pick has a pheromone. And that pheromone tells the pedophile that they can make an approach to that child because that child is no longer innocent. They tend to stay away from children who have not been abused. They choose the ones that have already been abused because the work's been done for them.
It doesn't. So, I don't think you literally mean pheromone. Maybe,
I do.
But,
I do.
A smell.
Okay. Yeah, that's what they call it.
But I wouldn't be surprised at all if. We're just conjecturing, but I wouldn't surprise at all if they could just see it in the body posture.
Dean, it's only by conjecture that eventually we could prove what we need to prove, because it's first thought creates matter. Let's remember that.
Of course.
You know, I think it raises a general issue. We've got to be able to talk about the causal role of the victim. Now, if you're doing science, you don't care about blame. That's for judges and juries. But you do care about cause, and victims, male victims can provoke their wives. We found that men who get assaulted by their wives are particularly likely to be drinking, so they provoke, you know, but women also provoke their husbands. And so you got to look. If you got to look at the interaction between them, sometimes the victim isn't pure and innocent, and there's an interaction going on, and we can't be afraid to talk about the causal role of victim. And nobody was afraid to talk about it until the feminist movement said you can't talk about the causal role of female victims. Otherwise, you're blaming the victim.
Yeah, can I ask you something, Rich? In so many of these personal relationships, you could almost say at times that there is a submissive, or if you like, and we're quite used to the idea of sadomasochism in clubs and in society, and who is the victim and who plays. But in personal relationships, the same thing can happen. That's why so many of them stay together, because there's a payoff for the fighting. The victim provokes, gets battered, and then it's the make-up time and everything's lovely, and then it all starts again. So I think we do need to look at why somebody knowing perfectly well if they push the buttons enough, the other person is going to explode and hit them. And I've often said, because when that happens, there's a change of power. And in between the two, that is an emotional game that goes on.
I don't know about that particular scenario. I do think power is important because I have a paper called Big People Hit Little People, which is what we found. When I say hit, unless there's a weapon changes the equation because the weaker party, it equalizes if the weaker party has a weapon. But big people hit little people. People pay a lot of attention to the power of their adversary because it could be dangerous for them otherwise. But that fact does not mean that they're motivated by power. And one of the things, there could be some offenders motivated by power. I'm perfectly willing to entertain that hypothesis, but nobody has shown it. There's no evidence to support it. And I think that men don't feel typically or look powerful by hitting women because people actually think they sometimes call them cowardly for doing it. And it's something they do behind closed doors where male-on-male violence is much more likely to be public. And, you might, a young man might show off to his friends getting in a fight with a man, but hitting a woman makes him look bad. So I don't think you're able to show power, but maybe some people feel that way. There's a large variety of people around.
We've been banging on feminists in this conversation, which, by the way, Erin and I are never shy of doing, because they should be confronted on a lot of the things they say. But I can't put it all on feminists. You said something in one of your papers called Context that I think that it's very important when we're looking at gendered issues. Oh, did I forget to mention that you've got a book out, don't you? What's your book called again?
Violence and Gender Reexamined. That's back in 2002, published by the American Psychological Association.
Violence and Gender Reexamined. That's right. Mm-hmm. Just wanted to get the plug out there for it. But anyway, you had a paper called, I think it was Back to Basics, and it might relate to that. I like this line. It says, you say, finally, chivalry should be an important element in any discussion of violence against women. And I think that's really an important point, and it may point to the roots of some of what we're talking about. We can say that feminist ideology is part of it, with the pseudoscientific notion that, and I'll just call it pseudoscientific notion, that it's all a patriarchal urge. But that chivalry concept is older, and I think it is an important element to a lot of this.
Yes, it's not talked about much because it's not a useful fact, but it's something everybody knows. We were earlier talking about compartmentalization. Everybody knows that boys, and everybody's taught, don't hit girls. But that fact is ignored in these discussions, and we say, we permit or we tolerate violence against women because we're sexist or society is patriarchal, whatever you want to say. And in fact, what's that?
I said, since when? I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, I'm not challenging you. I'm challenging that attitude. I hear the same thing. Yes, society tolerates violence against women. When? Yes. I'm 48. I want to know when that time period was.
Right. And the other thing is that when you compare men and women, violence against men and women, I think people just view this very differently. They really it emotionally bothers them much more if it's violence against women. And maybe because they want to protect women, maybe it's because they want to protect babies. I don't know, but chivalry. Now, the feminists say that we exchange, if women conform to gender roles, then they get protection. But if you compare women who violate gender roles by committing crime, they get more lenient sentences than men who commit the same crime. That's a consistent finding in criminal justice. Women get more lenient sentences. So, I don't think that's the reason, and we provide protection for women. And some of it may be rational in terms because women are physically weaker, And maybe it's in our genetic code, who knows, for evolutionary reasons.
That's where I think it is, because I think in primitive men and women, the fact is that there is a gene in men to be kinder and gentler and tender, with anything younger, well, smaller and weaker, is one of the reasons why women were able to survive.
Yes, it may be.
And I'm sure it is, because, I think part from, a culture like ours, which boys are taught from the very beginning that they should always respect women and never lift their hands to women.
Right.
And unfortunately now we've got to a stage where the majority of young men coming up are quite frightening, because of not only the feminist attitude, which is don't you dare patronize me with your chivalry, and the young girls are doing the same thing, but also with what's happening now with everything that young men are listening to. Their attitude to women is certainly not chivalrous.
Well, one thing to add to that is that women will hit men,
yes,
knowing he won't hit her back because of chivalry.
Yep.
And sometimes they do hit back, but usually not. But that's plays a role in all this, because men do not, if you're talking about domestic situation, women initiate slightly more than men do in those.
Yes, they do. Yes,
they
do.
Fights.
They do, and that's what's been hidden for years and years and years.
Right.
Have you any solutions for violence in our societies?
Well, now, I don't study that, but I'll say this.
Yeah.
For violence. You need to talk to my brother. My brother, Marcus Felson, is a criminologist, and a famous criminologist, whose his routine activity approach has had a great influence. And he says you got to reduce crime. It's very hard to change people.
Yeah.
But if you can reduce the opportunity to commit crime, and by having capable guardianship, by having victims who aren't too vulnerable, you can reduce the crime rate. You can't get rid of crime, of course, but anything you can do to alter the situation. If you'll notice, my work focuses on the situation, just like my brother's. And to prevent crime, you make the situations that lead to violent crime occur less often. And that's the line that I would go down. That is the path I would go down.
I'll tell you, I mean, and that is where the narrative that's so popular now seems so destructive, because, I mean, I've just had it happen to me before. What you just suggested is that people, both policymakers and individuals, might want to start looking at ways to keep themselves out of dangerous situations.
Yes. Well, they do that already, except not when you're talking about violence against women. They won't talk about it but we lock our doors, right? We stay out of bad neighborhoods at night. We do all sorts of things to avoid crime, being victimized. So those are forms of what they call situational crime prevention. That's associated with the routine activity approach. That you alter the environment in a way that creates fewer opportunities.
I suppose at a time, and certainly in my young life, where parents were also part of any relationship that was being made, it was with the permission of parents.
Right.
In small communities who all knew each other. It was far less likely for a woman to make a dangerous choice, because the parents would have known of the families.
Right.
So
and people know their neighbors, and their neighbors watch out for other people's kids.
And now, but there's no feeling now, when young people get together to shack up, there's no question of each other's history. I don't know if you've got this in America. We've got a law coming in where a man or a woman can check with the police station to see if there's any domestic violence in the background of their partner or their new partner. Which, I don't know if you've got that, but we've got that coming in now. Sorry about this. And my feeling is, although it's a horrific invasion of somebody's privacy, I have to accept that violence, domestic violence particularly, is a repeat pattern. And somebody who has a repeated pattern, it's a way of warning people off from getting involved with them.
But you've no way of knowing it in the modern environment, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
People don't know.
You don't know. I mean, personally, where people are extremely violent and dangerous in the family, I would like to see a government health warning stamped on their foreheads.
Well,
You don't mean that literally, I'm sure.
I do.
Hester Pride, did she have an A, adulteress?
Yeah, well, no, I don't mind her being adulterated. She can do that. But what I don't accept is that you can beat up, torture, and damage partners and children and get away with it.
Well, you know that violence tends to, people more likely to repeat violence outside the family, too. So if you want to predict, we have prisons full of offenders who are more likely to commit a crime when they get out than non-offenders, much more likely. So the same principle could be applied. I'm not in favor of the principle, but it's just as likely to involve repetition.
Well, that would be something I'm curious about. Has your research ever gone into, obviously, looking at violent criminals? Is there a pattern there? I mean, I would predict there is, but you can tell me maybe. Is there a pattern of abuse, childhood abuse, common or typical among the violent offenders?
Well, yeah, you'll find the correlation between being abused and offending. Yes. But I mean, whether it's causal or not, there's probably some causal effect, but we don't know that. But probably is some. But I wouldn't exaggerate it like some people do. It's correlated. It's not a really strong correlation, so it's probably a risk factor and has probably a causal effect.
I think that. We're probably going to have another professor on here sometime in the next couple of months, and she'll be talking to us about evidence that violence in the home starting in utero increases the risk of being violent. But I do think, and there is other research, and we've talked about it with other professors we've had on, I think it is important. Murray Strauss made this point too. If you came up in an abusive environment, it's very easy to be shamed into thinking, well, that means... You can get a stigma associated with that when someone hears, well, that's a predictor for violence. Yeah, most people who grow up in violent environments do not turn violent. And nobody here is suggesting that if you grew up in an abused environment, you're going to become a violent criminal. Just want to get that out there.
But Dean, it can also go the other way. Many people growing up in violent families, like myself, as a child knew that I had choices, and I was fortunate to have mentors. So my feeling is that, yes, accept that you've come from a family that has in many ways damaged you, but fortunately there are other alternatives, and you can transcend your violence. And that, in a sense, is what I think we should be looking at with criminals, that there must be a way that they can transcend their violence. Otherwise, again, as you say, Rich, it's a repeated pattern, because same as the mafia here, we don't have mafia, but we have whole criminal families. And it goes, again, down from one generation to another. Whereas, I've often, because I've done a lot of work in prisons here, and I've often thought to myself, the rich have, in England, we have clubs called Boodles and the Athenaeum, and the criminals have their own clubs. It's called Wandsworth, and are the other names of prisons. They even have their own newspapers.
Really?
And yeah, they do. Wandsworth one is called Wano, and they talk about their prisons as the rich men do about their clubs.
Well, I would say that first of all, I don't know much about the topic of preventing by changing individuals. I do know that it's very difficult. Some people don't believe it can be done. Mm-hmm. And when they think it can be done, it's, you got to think about the practicality and how expensive it is to try to some program. So it's just a difficult thing to do, and I certainly don't know how to do it, change individuals.
I wondered, Rich, one of the things I noticed is that we used to get a lot of families from Northern Ireland in the Troubles. So not only were they running from their violent father, but they're also already violent because they had been born and raised with bombs and fires and all that. So, war in itself creates a whole violent group of people, doesn't it?
Well, probably does, yes. And people with all sorts of problems. Yeah.
So you've talked about, and we're ranging all over the place here, but I want to get a little bit back to this academic apartheid you've talked about. For example, you've already just affirmed what we already know on this show, but most people don't know, which is that women are about as likely, if not more likely, to start hitting than men are, and men frequently won't even hit back, and women know this. I mean, there's this amazing video running around right now of this little... Okay, this is this is kind of an American context, but it's comical and it's not. There's this pint-sized little white girl, couldn't be more than 5'1" or 5'2", beating up a big black guy who's got at least a foot on her and at least 100, maybe 150 pounds on her, and she's just wailing on him, and all he's doing is backing up and backing up and backing up and backing up, and yet in the feminist narrative, that can't be so. She's clearly trying to provoke him into hitting her. My friend Attila Windsor has a 12-year-old son who recently had a first-grade girl come running up to him and punch him in the stomach and then say, "Ha ha, you can't hit me back because I'm a girl." It's like, and these sorts of things just make you think, why are we so afraid to look at women's violence? Well, like, we're afraid to do it. And
it's as if they think that women never get angry.
And they don't fart and they don't burp.
Yeah, it's just crazy. I mean, it's all the self-defense. I guess most of them aren't saying that anymore, but some of them do.
Do you think? Have you seen any? Are you seeing any sort of sign of change in the mentality and the willingness to look at this? I mean,
yes. Murray Strauss has led the way in that.
Professor Strauss, we had him on a couple of months ago.
Yes,
University of New Hampshire, I believe.
Right. Yeah. And quite elderly now, but still active, and a friend of mine, and a great man. He's led the way, and there's a journal now that's focused on this, and there is a group that's willing to examine domestic violence committed by both women and men, and in a non-ideological way. And they're growing, I think. And Murray Strauss's work now has to be recognized because it's been replicated many, many times.
That's the sign of real science, not just that you've got some good figures that hold up, but that others can replicate your results independently. Amazing that doesn't happen more often, right?
Right. Now, I might say, one of the deals I make is, because I look at violence generally, I say, well, men generally are 8 times more likely to commit violence. Why is it that there's gender parity between partners? In other words, you shouldn't be asking why men hit their wives. You should say, given that they tend to be 8 times more violent, why don't they hit them more often than their wives hit them? That's the thing we want to understand. I think it has to do with chivalry. Don't hit girls. Don't hit women. And to me, that's what needs to be explained. The inhibition.
I would actually be skeptical that I would be skeptical that men really are 8 times as more violent. And I'll tell you why before I'm sure you're more learned than I am, but you just already mentioned that there is strong evidence that there's a sentencing disparity, that women get off lighter for the same offenses than men do. Mm-hmm. They get lesser sentences, lesser punishments. There's strong evidence that victims of female violence are less likely to be reported. When they are reported, there's less likely to be an arrest. When they're arrested, there's less likely to be a formal charges pressed.
All true.
It that 8 times figure, I have to wonder if. All right,
let me tell you how I get that.
Okay.
It's not using official data of the police. 2 sources of data. First of all, homicides. That is from official data from the police. And, you're not going to get away with homicide if you're a woman. I mean, it's going to come to attention. And also victimization surveys, the National Crime Victimization Survey in the United States, where they ask people, has anybody hit you, done various things to you, and then they said, then they asked, well, what the person who did it, was it a male or a female? And that's the other way of finding that out. Those are some of them they ask, did you report it or not? So you can study that, but they have unreported crimes, and there you get more of male violence. And the typical, you probably know this, the typical victim is also a male. The typical violent event involves two males. So that's how we know men are much more violent.
They're about twice as likely to be the victims of violence as women are. And okay, I'll accept your educated belief. I'm going
Let me elaborate on what you just said.
Sure.
You always have to distinguish minor and serious. The more serious the violence, the more likely the victims to be a man. Mm-hmm. So, now it is also true that men in domestic situations produce more injury than women do. Although I've found that, and somebody else has found, that the injuries they produce are less serious than the injuries that the women produce. I was surprised to see that.
Well, because as women always say, weapons are a great leveler.
Right.
And the majority of women I know who have done serious harm and killed the men involved did use knives.
Well, and there's something else too, which I already asked Rich this before the class, or before class, yeah, before the show. Something else that doesn't get, sometimes people don't even look at, because I really think this topic of women's violence doesn't get studied enough, and I'm hoping up and coming PhDs and postdocs start looking more at this. But I forgot what I was going to. Oh, proxy violence. There's been a little bit of study on it, but not enough. For example, if you look at the domestic violence surveys and you look at domestic violence homicides, if a woman hires a hitman or gets her new boyfriend to kill her husband or current boyfriend, that is not recorded as a domestic violence homicide. And so that is actually a woman using a man as a weapon.
Right.
There's at least one study of that in Palestine, I believe, which showed that 2/3 of honor killings, honor killing is when a man goes out and kills his daughter or his wife or something like that because she's besmirched the family's honor. In more than 2/3 of the cases, his wife or his mother told him to do it, which of course does not alleviate his guilt, but there's a causal factor there and there's a role for women in there, and it's like we're afraid to look at that somehow.
Right. Well, I hope you will send me that reference because I didn't know it. I found it was very interesting.
I will find it for you and I will get it for you. I've just been too busy. So now, of course, we're otherwise in a realm that Rich isn't into. So let's get back to something else you said. This is interesting too. You said violence against women occurs despite, not because of societal norms. And I guess that gets back to the topic, but it's interesting. Can you back that up?
Yes. The norm. Well, for example, you give do an experiment, and you show a scenario of two people hitting each other, and one it's a man hitting a woman, and one it's a woman hitting a man. And you can have it in the family, domestic or outside. And regardless, people evaluate violence against women much more seriously. They think than the violence against men. It's clear, and in a sense, it's common sense because we all know that's true. But it's been demonstrated with experimental data. Now, let me add to that. It's not a new thing. Elizabeth Pleck has written about the history in the United States, at least, of attitudes about domestic violence. Sometimes she'll look at court cases and what the judges say. And they had a problem with privacy issues. So what happens when a man hits a woman and they're married and it's not too serious? For example, they had a case. A man grabbed a woman by the hair and pulled her down to the floor. And they had this case, and they said, well, is this a private issue we shouldn't get into? And they said in the decision, this was 150 years ago or something, they said, well, it's not that we
a vast virus
think
database
that's okay,
has been updated.
But the question is, should the state intervene? And what's changed over time is beliefs about state intervention in family affairs, either regarding violence against women, violence against children. Now we're quick to intervene, and the Puritans were quick to intervene. But it's sometimes in our history didn't want the government intervening in those sorts of things. It was a matter of attitudes toward privacy. And there was never, for example, you've heard the thing, the rule of thumb?
Yes.
There was no rule of thumb. That was made up. They didn't tolerate, long ago they didn't tolerate it. It was always been a problem. What do you do when women are being assaulted by their husbands, and when do you intervene? The Ku Klux Klan not only went against blacks and Jews and Catholics, they went against wife beaters.
I know that. They ran ads in newspapers warning men that the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, if you hit your wife, will come for you.
Right.
People don't know that. There's also an interesting...
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to mention to everybody, there's a fascinating study, or a paper, actually, a pretty comprehensive review from the Journal of Men's Studies by Malcolm George. It's a classic paper, published in 1994. It's called Riding the Donkey Backwards, Men as the Unacceptable Victims of Marital Violence. And actually, laws against husbands hitting their wives go back many centuries. Laws against wives hitting their husbands, much more rare. Even the laws that allowed men to hit their wives always carried limitations so that they were not allowed to go too far. Sure. Whereas laws to protect men from their wives, virtually not, very hard to find in history. Right. The point is, the paper in question is called Riding the Donkey Backwards, Men as the Unacceptable Victims of Marital Violence by Malcolm George from Queen Mary and Westfield College in the UK. And in various parts of history, not only would a man not have any defense under law if his wife beat him, he would be punished. If he allowed himself to be harmed by his wife, the town would put him on a donkey, backwards, tie him to that donkey, and ride him through town while people threw rotten fruit and vegetables at him and called him names because he allowed himself to be beaten. And I can definitely send you that paper because I got it in front of me right now.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is. We used to punish men for being victims of domestic violence. It's an amazing paper, Riding the Donkey Backwards by Malcolm George.
Right.
So, well, we've wandered a little off topic here. Where are we? I found. Oh, okay. One more thing I wanted to ask you about. You have another paper you put out. Is this one published? It's called Contexts.
Mm-hmm.
And you used the National Violence Against Women Survey to produce some of this data, right? Now that's an American survey, right? Yes. What I found interesting there is that while it's called the National Violence Against Women Survey, at least in domestic violence anyway, what you see on the top line reports isn't always adequately reflective of what's actually in the data presented. Mm-hmm. For example, you noted something about what are called controlling behaviors, which are known to be risk factors for domestic abuse, and controlling behaviors like prevent someone from working outside the home, insist on knowing who the other part, who the spouse is with at all times or where they are at all times, suddenly changing residences, demanding to change residences with no real explanation or reason, trying to limit their contact with family and friends. Shocking. Well, I don't know. It shouldn't shock us, but it would shock a lot of people, I think, to realize that survey showed statistically there's almost no difference in men's tendency to do those things than women.
That's right.
You show a small difference, like men are slightly more likely to prevent their wife from working outside the home, although I was shocked to see that even there the variance isn't that high. It's 1.6% versus 1%.
And notice how rare it is for both of them.
Right. The stereotype is that men do it all the time. 1.6% of husbands do that, and 1% of wives do that. Insist on knowing where they are at all times. This is actually consistent with what I've seen in my own life. Husbands, knowing where your partner is at all times. Husbands, 7.1% do that. Wives, 9.6%. Not a huge statistical variation, but it's actually consistent with what I've seen in my life. Women are a little more likely to be that way. How is it that we so often see these surveys where they come to they draw these huge sweeping conclusions about violence against women or harm to women, but then you bury down and just look at their source data and you see much more parity? How does the mindset even come in that they can't see in their own data what it's showing?
I don't think they include that data in their own studies. They, when they cite things, they'll cite, you go and you look back at what they're citing, and they're citing somebody else who said it, not data.
That's so something that Mary Strauss has talked about.
Yes, they have, you can't tell when they claim something. And this is a problem in general in the social sciences, but particularly among these activists, they cite other people saying things, like the rule of thumb, which didn't exist. They cited somebody else, and we go look at them, and they cite somebody else, and then it goes nowhere because it didn't exist. It referred to carpentry, not to women and men.
Professor Richard Gelles came up with a phrase that I think is worth using. Murray Strauss calls what you're talking about there proof by citation, right?
Right.
And
nice.
Richard Gelles uses the term the woozle effect. And that's just, it comes from Winnie the Pooh, and they were hunting something called a woozle in the snow, and they kept finding more and more and more woozle tracks until eventually they realized they were going in a circle and following their own tracks over and over and over again. You see that in a lot of research. I don't think it's just the social sciences, but you see it in a lot of research. Someone says it, someone else cites it, someone else cites it again, somebody else cites them, citing them, and nobody's ever gone back and questioned the premise in the first place.
One example of that is false charges for rape. They cited a study for many years, and people looked, and there was no study.
Yes. There used to be a frequent claim in social science that only 2% of all rape allegations are false. And the source for that was Susan Brownmiller.
Right, exactly.
I believe you knew her, Erin.
Yeah, I know her very well. She came and stayed with me in Italy. She did recant.
Well, it's good to know. I wish she did publicly.
Yeah, she wrote a book. She came badly unstuck with her sisters because there was a case where an editor in New York with an adopted 2 children, and she was a children's editor, and her husband was guilty. He was found guilty and jailed for child abuse, and Susan had the courage to stand up and say, no, this woman isn't an abused woman. She was part of the abuse. So she suddenly got turned on.
Talking about the Hedda Nussbaum case.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. That's the most cited book, the earlier one, on rape.
Her books on rape. She sent them all to me, and I told her I wouldn't read them because they're a load of rubbish.
Right.
Against our will.
You have to be very careful about rape and women. There's a big question women have to answer. I'm not going to ask you lot to answer it because you're men. Why is it when a book called 50 Shades of Grey, which is soft-core porn, and there's nothing else in it except porn, why did 55 million women read it?
And it's sadomasochistic porn, too.
Yeah, all 3 books. Isn't that extraordinary? Tells you a lot about women's fantasies, doesn't it?
Well, I'm afraid it does. Just to get back to the Susan Brownmiller thing, I've hunted down this particular woozle very well, and not only did that 2% figure come out of her, but she got it because she heard a professor say it once as an offhand guess.
Mm-hmm.
So a professor makes an offhand guess in the 1960s. She puts it in her book. Now people start citing it, and it's just a fact.
Right.
Even now, on the false rape allegation, the more realistic estimate that is still bounded about is 4%. And where they're getting that from is cases that can be absolutely and definitively proven not to have been false.
Right, right.
Which is not
right.
a legitimate way of arriving at that conclusion either.
Right.
That would be the most conservative possible estimate. I don't think we have a realistic estimate on what false allegations look like. I mean,
it's difficult.
It would depend even on how you ask the question.
Right.
Do you know of any studies on that question?
Yes. I mean, I've seen estimates based on data up to 40%, but that's Eugene Cannon, the Kanin. But I don't know if he is a careful study. He did a good job, and he asked them why they might found out why they lied. Usually they found out real quick. It's some young girl, and she says it, or her mother says it, and she goes to the police, and then it's dropped very quickly. But they find a lot of it, and I mean, that's one study. Who knows?
No, nobody really knows. I believe that it's part of the academic apartheid that you're talking about, to be honest.
Right.
It's not an acceptable question. I cannot believe the rage that I've seen come out of people of all sorts of political stripes if you even broach the subject or suggest that there's something wrong or questionable about the very low figure there.
Right.
I tell them the same thing. Anybody who tells you they know what the rate of false rape allegations is lying to you. Because I don't believe anybody, even you mentioned Kanan, who came up with a roughly 40%, he will admit, well, this is based on certain methodologies and certain ways of looking at it. I don't believe he claims that figure as the answer. This is the direction the data pointed him. It's just like a taboo subject area, and it shouldn't be. People say, well, why would a woman lie? Well, the answer is usually pretty obvious. To explain an unwanted, an otherwise inconvenient pregnancy, to not want to explain her adultery away.
Well, here's what he found, if I can recall the different reasons which were most frequent. Some of them, like they excusing some behavior, like a girl comes home late, and her mother says, where were you? And then she's got to get off the hook, so she says, well, I was raped. Or she's mad at the guy, and so here's an example. He said he would withdraw during intercourse, and he didn't. And then she's mad at him, and she says that. So there, people sometimes don't tell the truth, obviously, or they try to get themselves out of a predicament, or they get angry at a guy. Maybe it has to do, let's say a guy is real nasty to his girlfriend, and he's bigger than her, and she doesn't know how to get him back, and so maybe she makes a false charge against him. How frequent that is, I don't know.
Well, and that gets back to that proxy violence issue I have mentioned. There's a little but not enough study on it. Revenge is one of the motivators. There was a horrible case in the UK not too long ago of a boy, he was about 15, who was savagely beaten to death by a group of young men. And he was savagely beaten to death because one of their female friends said, that boy raped me. And subsequently she recanted.
Right.
And said, I was just angry with him. I didn't expect you to go and do something like that. There's a dead boy. Right. Now, and I know of a case personally, anecdotes are anecdotes, right? But the plural of anecdote is data, as they say. I know a girl who accused a boy of raping her, and they didn't beat him to death, but the exact same thing happened. The police were never involved, but all of her friends went and found him one night and just kicked the crap out of him, put him in the hospital. And to this day, she admits she was really high on drugs and doesn't remember if she consented or not. She said it's because some people would say, well, if she was drunk, she couldn't consent. But the point is, she felt ambivalent about that result. That's, right. Men have this chivalrous impulse to protect women somehow, and they'll beat the crap out of a man because they just accept an allegation must be true. I know I'm pontificating now, but there's a case going on in California now of a woman who was extradited from Italy because 20 years ago she accused a man of raping her. And then she left the country, never had him formally charged, and a group of her friends, male friends, went out and killed him. And now she's on trial for manslaughter. They finally extradited her. So I think that's a good result because she admits, she didn't tell them to do this, but she told all of her friends and made it clear that she wished something bad would happen to him, and they killed him.
Incidentally, Cannon's study, he measured false allegations by whether the woman recanted. And so they recanted that in 40% of the time, and they usually recanted very quickly so it didn't harm the accused too much, but it did harm him somewhat. And this was a Lighton Police Department. They had a special sexual assault unit, and they weren't trying to force recantation. They were trying to do their job the best they could.
I really hope and pray we see more research on it, because if we want to fix problems, so there's the other thing. Again, I'm pontificating, but I think a lot of so-called activists really are not invested in fixing the problems. They're interested in the problems continuing. And I know that sounds very cynical, but I think Erin would back me up that there are some who are like that.
I think most of them. No, I think it's a $1 billion industry. No rabid feminist has got any interest in finding any solutions. Why would they? Certainly it's been jobs for the girls right the way across the academic world, all the services in law courts and judiciary. No, that no one has any interest except the victims in getting things changed. And a handful of right-thinking people.
You might like this story. I'm not sure how many of them have that motive, but when we had at Penn State this sexual scandal with the Sandusky molesting, the ex-coach molesting boys. Yeah. Okay. And so Penn State was going to try to change the atmosphere here somehow, that we had been permitted that to happen. So they were giving out money. And the people who got the initial money was a women's group. Mm. And everybody said, and even the head of women's studies, I heard her say it, why are they getting the money if there's a man molesting a boy? Why is a women's group getting it? And the answer was, well, they're very well organized, and they jump on it, and they're good at getting money.
Yeah. And they're women. And we know that only men rape women, because that's how everybody thinks. And just as long as you give women enough money in universities, and anyway, most of the people who are giving out the money are women anyway, this is going to perpetuate itself.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't helping victims. I know, now of course part of it is because I'm an activist, but I don't make a lot of money at it. My income is not dependent on continuing a problem. I know a couple, 3 victims personally of women being sexually violent to them, and nobody wants to talk about it. I mean, it's just like no, we can't have that. They don't want to study it. They don't want to, or they want to minimize it as much as they can, so they don't even have to look at the question. And it's odd. I'm sorry. What were you going to say, Rich?
Yeah, well, they've done at least one study of you look at a scenario, this experimental study, and they describe a scenario where somebody forces someone else to have sex, engages in a sexual assault, and they manipulate the gender of the offender and the victim. And when men are sexually assaulted by women, they are given the most blame, more than the other gender combinations. So when women sexually assault men, the men are given the most blame. that more blame than when men are assaulted by men, women by men, all the other gender combinations.
Yeah, that's in Phil Cook's book, When Women Sexually Abuse Men. It is surprising, just when you ask surveys like in the last year, were you forced to have sex against your will, men are about as likely to, not quite, but they're about as likely to report having that experience as women are. And it's usually heterosexual, which means usually it's a woman who's pushing them into the encounter. Sometimes that's graphic and at knife point kind of crazy drama. Sometimes it's a lot more ambiguous, just like rape itself is often ambiguous. Sorry, but it often is, right? But we don't want to look at it in a gendered context. What is the basic thrust of your book on violence and gender reexamined? Anyway.
Well, just what we've been talking about. Examine violence against women in the larger context. See how it's different. You've got to look at all types of violence. See if it's underreported. When we say underreported, compared to what? And women are actually more likely than men to call the police when they're victims. So always make comparisons. I look at both intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And I'm pretty open criticizing feminists. Usually I'm not. You may have noticed I don't use the F word because they it gets them even more angry than they already are. I don't know if it really matters, but you got to be careful when you're writing an article if you want to get it accepted for publication. And most of the people in this area are going to be feminists, and so how are you going to get it by them? And that's not easy. So, but when I wrote the book, that's why I wrote the book. I could say everything I wanted to say, and I was very critical of them. And I could not get the book reviewed in Sociology, but and then I did get some reviews, and most of them scathing, but from feminist reviewers.
And that was put out by the American Psychological Association, which doesn't exactly publish fluffery and pseudoscience.
Yes, they've published all my books, and I talked to them. They were women who were in charge, and I talked to the executive editor, and they of course knew how controversial, and they thought it was. They liked the book, and they thought it needed to be said, and now they were telling me 8 years later, we're glad we did it. And so I was pleased with what they. With their actions there.
Well, it does.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, it does indicate to me that some of this is changing. I remember when we talked to Don Dutton, he thinks it's changing.
Yes.
Bill Cook, he thinks it's changing. It may be that old phrase, "Science advances one funeral at a time."
Right.
The younger people are more open to hearing this message than the older ones. Erin, weren't you telling me, we mentioned earlier, I mentioned Richard Gelles, and you mentioned, when we were talking about Murray Strauss, weren't you telling me that back in the 70s when you all first started talking about this, Rich is talking about having people savage him with bad reviews, but weren't you actually getting threats and such back in the day?
Yeah, because it was about 1974, so my refuge had been open for about 4 years. There was no research at that time anywhere. And I was asked to go to America, and I met Murray Strauss, Richard, and Susan Steinmetz as their researchers, and they were keen to begin the research on this particular subject, and that's what we were talking about. And almost immediately, because I think they had assumed, like everybody else, that the information they were being given was accurate, that it was women who were being abused by men. But as soon as they began to do their research, they were all brave enough to stand up and say, hold on, this doesn't hang together. We're now bringing a professional forensic look at what's actually happening behind that front door. And certainly they were threatened, and I have been too. I mean, Susan Steinmetz her family was threatened with danger, and often Murray and Richard and all of us were, but anybody who crossed what was then an enormously powerful overnight movement, which was the Marxist feminists. It was never, as you know, it's never a women's movement. Anyway, the most important point of this is, yes, I mean, it was only about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I was doing a tour of Canada with Senator Ann Cools, and we were to speak in Vancouver, and the senator was surrounded by police because a radical group in Vancouver had threatened to bomb us. So yes, it does happen. And look what's been happening at universities in Toronto.
Yeah, I don't know if you've caught that, Rich, but in Toronto and University of Ottawa and Queen's University in Kingston, just having people come in to talk about issues like this. Radical feminists come in, start, we got it on tape now, so you can't even deny that it's happening. Come in, start banging sticks on the floor, banging on cups, chanting, yelling, screaming, not allowing the speakers to be heard. At least twice now, fire alarms have been pulled just so that the speakers couldn't go on. It's particularly crazy in Canada. If you ever get a speaking invitation to go up to Canada, Rich, just be careful.
Dean, I've been asked to go next month.
Oh, well, we don't care about you, Erin. You're just a woman, so we don't care about violence.
That's right.
Yeah, actually, I will put in a plug for that. Erin is going to be, Attila Windsor, who's also AVFM's activism director, will be having a major symposium on domestic violence in Toronto, where a lot of professionals will be coming. That'll be in early June. I don't have the specific dates, but when I get them from him, I'll make sure we get it out on the show. And Erin will be there.
Hopefully it's the 6th to the 8th of June at the moment, yeah.
That sounds about right. That'll mostly be for professionals, although I expect a lot of people to be there. Cops, attorneys, social workers, psychologists. Yeah. Heck, maybe somebody ought to extend an invitation to Rich Felson. Maybe I'll put that bug in Attila's ear.
Yeah.
We're getting near the end of the show here, so I also want to put another plug in. AVFM is having the first International Men's and Boys Issues Conference this year in late June. If you go to the front page of A Voice for Men, you'll see June 27th and 28th. Erin will be speaking there. Warren Farrell will be speaking there. Senator Ann Cools will be speaking there. And quite a few others will be there. That's something you don't want to miss, June 27th and 28th. Actually, Warren's doing a special pre-show on Thursday the 26th where he talks about men's and boys issues. I guess at that conference, we're not taking a gender-neutral approach. We really are looking at an understudied issue of where men and boys get the short end of the stick in society these days, and that's a pretty big deal. I mean, just in education alone, the university seems like it's emptying of men. What are you still teaching full time, Rich?
Yes, I am.
And what's the average sex these days of your students?
Well, I've been teaching the honors courses, and that's more female. But of course, it's well known that there are more females than males in college. But
it is. It's reaching a 60-40 percentage, and it may be as low as 37% male now within the next few years. That's a stunning reversal from 30 years ago, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Now, did you know, one thing you didn't ask me about is my recent stuff on blaming the victim.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. We got a few more minutes here. Blaming the victim. Yes, a constant drumbeat we hear is that when we tell women to try and protect themselves, that's blaming the victim. That's not treating their trauma seriously. What do you think about the blaming the victim thing?
Well, we found, and someone else has found, that people blame victims of robbery more than they blame victims of rape. When you use the same scenario in an experiment, so everything's controlled, but you manipulate whether the victim was robbed or raped, say after she engages in some reckless behavior. She gets drunk and passes out at a party. That's what we had, one of the scenarios we used. And then she gets robbed. No, she gets raped. One of the two. And robbery will lead to more blaming than rape will. And I think what's going on there, nobody wants to use the word robbery, the word blame when you're talking about rape. That's one thing that's going on. But also what's happening is that when victims engage, or anybody engages in what we think is reckless behavior, we criticize them and we give them some blame, not as much as if they committed a crime. Most of the blame is going to be given to the offender. But when I left my tennis racket in my locker unlocked, I assigned some blame to myself. I was angry at myself. You know, it's a basic way of thinking among people. It doesn't just have to do with rape. It has to do with any reckless behavior that the victim might have engaged in. And when you ask about irresponsibility, do you think a woman's irresponsible if she gets raped after being drunk and blacked out? You get, it's about the same as robbery, rape and robbery. So there's not a problem with overblaming rape victims.
So, contrary to popular myth, the popular myth is that when a woman is raped, everybody wants to point the finger at her and say, "You slut." And in point of fact, the reality is the opposite, and people are less likely to blame her if she's a victim of rape than if she's a victim of practically any other crime.
Well, this has been done with college students only.
Okay, still.
And so we're going to do it. We're going to try to get money or get onto a national survey and get adults and see if we get the same results. But it doesn't look like it's more likely to blame rape victims, or more likely to think that the victims are irresponsible for what they did.
Destroys the very notion that we live in a so-called rape culture that normalizes the victimization of women.
Exactly.
I mean, it's absurd. Well, Rich, Professor Felson, it's been a real honor and a real treat talking to you. We've been going 90 minutes now, and I bet we could go another 90, but we really should start wrapping up. Is there anything else you'd like to mention to the audience, Rich?
Let's see. No, I guess I've really not that I can think of it at this point.
You told me some funny stories before the show, but we didn't get them in. We might invite you on some other time. Would that be okay?
Sure.
I might also ask to talk to that brother of yours you mentioned. But
right.
In any case, Erin, do you have any closing thoughts for the audience this week?
No, I think we had a very exhaustive discussion, and it's lovely to hear from you again, Rich, and see you, hope, in one of these conferences.
I hope so.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.
See y'all.
We'll see you in 2 weeks. It looks like our guests will either be from a group in Ireland called Amen, just possibly Senator Ann Cools. We shall see. And otherwise, have a great week. We'll talk to you all later. James, if you would please take us home.
You have been listening to Domestic Violence Revelations with Erin Pizzey and me, her co-host, Dean Esme. Our show's opening music and closing music is known as Sunshine and Eternal Hope, respectively, and is by Kevin MacLeod and used under Creative Commons Attribution License, with a link in the show notes. We also want to thank James Huff and Paul Elam, and all of those who are part of the A Voice for Men community for their support for this show. Remember, if you're a victim of domestic violence, no matter if you're a man or a woman, gay or straight, adult or child, no matter what your race, your ethnicity, your religious views, your sexual orientation, or anything else, what you went through or are going through now is not okay. You should not be afraid to talk about it with people who understand and care. Just remember to talk to people who do understand, and not to ideologues who fear the truth or will marginalize you and your experiences. Remember, the truth about domestic abuse is often painful to hear, especially to ideologues, and especially to those who've been through it and been marginalized and ignored. But remember, in truth, there is hope and healing. And we hope you'll be a part of helping to spread the truth and the healing. Please join us next time on Domestic Violence Revelations with Erin Pizzey and yours truly, Dean Esme. God bless.